President, I rise today to lend my voice in support of perhaps one of the most qualified individuals ever nominated to the United States Supreme Court. I'm referring, of course, to Chief Judge Merrick Garland. And over 1 year ago, on March 16, 2016, a president who was twice elected by significant margins in both the popular vote and the Electoral College nominated Judge Garland to fill the vacancy left by the death of Justice Antonin Scalia. President Obama upheld his constitutional duty by submitting a name to the Senate to fill this vacancy. And by submitting the name of Merrick Garland, he gave the Senate a man who has spent his career working to build consensus and to find principled compromises. His impeccable credentials speak for themselves. Harvard undergrad, top of his class. Harvard Law, top of his class. Law clerk to Judge Friendly on the Second Circuit and Justice Brennan on the Supreme Court. He served in the Justice Department after a time in private practice. And when tragedy befell Oklahoma City in April of 1995, Merrick Garland led the investigation that brought justice to the perpetrators of that unthinkable act of terrorism. Judge Garland called this work, and I quote him, "the most important thing I've ever done in my life." But his career was far from over at that point. In 1997, Republicans and Democrats joined together here to confirm Judge Garland to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which is often called the second highest court in the land. Here's what Senator Orrin Hatch, former chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee and currently the president pro tem of the Senate, said of him at the time. And I quote him, "Merrick B. Garland is highly qualified to sit on the D.C. Circuit." He went on to say his intelligence and his scholarship cannot be questioned. His legal experience is equally impressive. Accordingly, I believe, and again, this is Senator Hatch speaking, I believe Mr. Garland is a fine nominee. I know him personally. I know of his integrity. I know of his legal ability. I know of his honesty. I know of his acumen, and he belongs on this court. Not my words, the words of Senator Orrin Hatch, a good friend and colleague. Over the past 2 decades on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, Judge Garland established a reputation as a thoughtful judge, as a fair judge, a man of high integrity, a consensus builder. At a day and age when we need consensus builders, not just here, but on the Supreme Court and other courts, and a judicial moderate. And even those who may disagree with him tend to find themselves thinking a little harder about their own views after hearing his. During his 2005 confirmation hearing to serve as Chief Justice, John Roberts, who served with Judge Garland on the D.C. Circuit, stated these words. This is John Roberts. "Anytime Judge Garland disagrees, you know you're in a difficult area." Thank you, Chief Justice Roberts. In 2013, Judge Garland was promoted to Chief Judge of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, second highest court in the land, the Chief Judge presiding over that court. And when President Obama nominated him to the Supreme Court over 1 year ago, Judge Garland brought with him more federal judicial experience than any nominee in the history of the United States. In the history of the United States. When I met with Judge Garland last year, I got to know him beyond just his resume. Ironically, he had actually performed the marriage ceremony for my former chief of staff and his bride several years ago. But I was struck last year again by Judge Garland's humility and by his personal character, his personal traits. Even as a nominee for the Supreme Court, he continued to serve his community as a mentor to elementary school students right here in Washington, D.C. Imagine that. Chief Judge of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, taking time every week to mentor some kid who needs another good role model in his or her life. And that's something that Judge Garland has done for, I guess, about 2 decades. 2 decades. Mr. President, over 1 year later, as I stand here today, a seat on the Supreme Court, what should, in my view, be Judge Garland's seat remains vacant. Our Republican colleagues, in an unprecedented display of, I think, obstructionism, partisanship, denied Judge Garland a hearing and a vote. Many of our Republican colleagues refused to even meet with him, and he was denied both a hearing in the Judiciary Committee and a cloture vote in the full Senate. Well, since the Senate Judiciary Committee began holding public hearings on Supreme Court nominees 101 years ago, in 1916, no Supreme Court nominee has ever been denied a hearing and a vote. I'll say that again. No Supreme Court nominee has ever been denied a hearing and a vote. Well, until Judge Garland. According to the highly respected website Scottish blog, we read these words: "The historical record does not reveal any instances since at least 1900 of the president failing to nominate and or the Senate failing to confirm a nominee in a presidential election year because of the impending election." That's right off the blog. But Judge Garland was denied a hearing and a vote. In fact, during the 1988 presidential election year, Justice Anthony Kennedy was confirmed by the Senate. Not 51-49, not 60-40, 97-0. 97-0. But Judge Garland was denied a hearing and a vote. Mr. President, our Constitution, the one that every member of this great deliberative body has sworn an oath to uphold, standing right over there, requires the United States Senate to provide its advice and consent to Supreme Court nominees. Over the years, a lot of questions. What does advice and consent entail? But Judge Garland was denied a hearing and a vote. A good man, and I think an extraordinary man, was treated badly. Badly. And so is our Constitution. I believe the unprecedented obstruction our Republican colleagues mounted last year against Judge Garland was a shameful chapter for the United States Senate. Judge Garland, a consensus builder and one of the most qualified judges in our country, waited 293 days for a hearing and a vote that ultimately never came. I'm still deeply troubled by those 293 wasted days, and I am still deeply troubled by how Judge Garland was treated. I believe Judge Garland still deserves a hearing, and he still deserves a vote. And while I do not believe that two wrongs make a right, I believe that this may be our only opportunity to right a wrong and erase the enormous black mark that the Senate's failure to consider Judge Garland leaves on this chapter of American history. I think it's unacceptable to put partisan politics over fidelity to our Constitution. Confirming anyone for this vacancy other than Judge Garland would be a stamp of approval for playing politics with Supreme Court nominees. From where I sit, upholding our oath to protect the Constitution means finding agreement on moving Judge Garland's nomination forward at the same time as Judge Neil Gorsuch's, President Trump's Supreme Court nominee. And when President Trump lost the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes last year, narrowly won the Electoral College, he promised to be a president for all Americans. I think a fair question is, has he upheld that promise? Will you decide? An unconstitutional Muslim ban, an unnecessary and overpriced wall on the southern border, a failed health care bill that would have provided less coverage for more money, a rollback of environmental protection for all of us who don't want to drink dirty water and don't want to breathe dirty air. If you ask me, this president has broken the promise to be president for all Americans. And I realize others may differ and disagree. But His nomination of Judge Gorsuch represents what I believe is another broken promise. I've heard from middle-class folks, from workers up and down my state, from special education teachers, from immigrant communities, from women who depend on access to health care. And my guess is my colleagues have as well. Many of them fear that Judge Gorsuch is not on their side. And despite his impressive resume, I share those same concerns. At this time, I believe it's appropriate to hit the pause button until an agreement can be reached that provides justice for Judge Garland while restoring credibility in the United States Senate. That belief is only bolstered by the cloud that lingers over President Trump's campaign. As FBI Director Jim Comey testified last week, there is an ongoing investigation to determine the links between Russia and the Trump campaign and whether there was any coordination between the Trump campaign and Russia to interfere in the 2016 election. It's also been widely reported in the media that officials from the upper echelon of the Trump campaign have close ties to Vladimir Putin's interest in weakening democratic governments throughout the West. There are many Americans who believe that Judge Gorsuch has been nominated for a stolen Supreme Court seat. There are also a number of Americans who believe that he has been nominated by a man whose campaign may have coordinated with foreign adversaries on stealing a presidential election. At the moment, let me be clear, at the moment no evidence has been made public to indicate that this is the case. But there are few nominations that any president will make that will have more of an impact and on our Constitution and on the lives of everyday Americans than the United States Supreme Court. To hastily move forward with Judge Gorsuch, who is 49 years old, could serve on the Supreme Court well into the middle of this century, without first getting to the bottom of the suspicions and the irregular actions of the Trump campaign officials, I believe would be a mistake. The American people need to know that the president's campaign was above reproach before we decide whether Judge Gorsuch merits approval for a lifetime appointment. Mr. President, our presiding officer from Indiana, I will close my remarks by offering a word of caution to my colleagues. We have maintained and preserved a 60-vote threshold for Supreme Court nominees to prevent Democrats and Republicans from choosing political expediency over bipartisan concerns and bipartisan consensus. If Judge Gorsuch fails to obtain 60 votes on the cloture vote next week, I would think it could signal one of maybe three things. First, that Judge Gorsuch's views are outside the political, or the judicial rather, mainstream. Second, that we still have an opportunity to rectify the injustice done to Judge Garland and to our Constitution. Or third, that we still do not know the nature of the relationship between the Trump campaign and Russia, a country whose leadership has ordered an attack on our election and our democracy, as well as a whole lot of other countries around the world. If Judge Gorsuch fails to achieve 60 votes on the first try or the next try, it does not mean that his nomination will not move forward at some point in the future. It means we have hit the pause button. It may very well be that while we've paused, another vacancy on the court could emerge. Who knows when another vacancy might occur? But if you ask me, another vacancy might present the Senate with an opportunity to right what I believe is an historic wrong. And we should see if the other objections that have been raised about Judge Gorsuch could be addressed before we change the rules of the Senate in favor of the party in power. In closing, I'll say again, Judge Garland waited 293 days for a hearing and a vote that never came. Judge Gorsuch waited 48 days for a hearing, and we may be voting on his nomination next week. Talk about a rush to judgment.
Senator's time has expired.
I would ask unanimous consent for 15 more seconds, please.
Without objection.
Thank you. Talk about a rush to judgment. We have time. The American people are watching us, and history will judge us. Let's make sure we get this right. Let's make sure we get this right. And with that, I yield the floor.